Funding for this program is made possible by Burke Nursery and Garden Center in Burke, Virginia. You'll find trees and shrubs, perennials and annuals, water garden supplies, houseplants, and bird and gardening supplies. Burke Nursery also provides landscape, plant diagnostic, and installation services, and much more. For more information, you can check out their website or call 703-323-1188. Welcome to Gardening with Burke Nursery, the show where we help you grow your garden and increase the curb appeal of your yard. I'm your host, Misty Kuceris, the horticulturalist at Burke Nursery and Garden Center. Of all the plants that are out there in the world, I would say the trees are among the most important. They provide habitat for wildlife, shade for your yard, calmness for your soul, and increased value to your home. With more of us planting trees, it's fun to know what you can select for your yard. So I invite you to join me today as we talk about selecting your tree. One of the first questions that I'm asked is, when is the right time to plant a tree? Well, fall is usually the best time to plant the tree. And the reason for that is that your carbohydrates and your microhesiums, which attach to the stems, attach to the roots of your trees, enable those roots to grow better. In addition, in fall, while you still need to water your tree, your newly planted tree, to make sure those roots develop, you may not need to water as frequently as you do in spring or summer. You can actually plant trees any time of year if you're aware of their watering techniques. And there are some trees, like your fruit trees, they prefer to be actually planted in the spring. And then other trees, which are crepe myrtles, which actually technically they're shrubs with an attitude that can get them up to 20 feet tall. They like to actually be planted in the month of August, although planting them during the month of during the month of September or the month of October works just as fine. They're happy to be in your yard and in the ground. So I would like to share with you some of the trees that you may want to consider, especially if you're living here in the Northern Virginia area. And the first tree is what I call the flowering dogwood. And this is right here, the leaf of a flowering dogwood. And this is also the berries. And these berries are called dupes. So they're actually called fruit, which are called dupes. And these are on your flowering dogwood. The flowering dogwood tree is a native to the eastern coast of the United States. And here in Virginia, the flowering dogwood is not only the state tree of the Commonwealth of Virginia, but it's also the state flower. And the flowering dogwood, by the way, the berries on the flowering dogwood turn red in the fall. And the berries are actually edible by birds, but they're not edible by humans. So please, when it comes to your native flowering dogwood, never eat the berries. The flowers are beautiful, and the petals actually that are white are actually called bracts. So they're really leaves that have turned into these beautiful, what look like flowers, and the actual flower is in the center, which is that yellow portion of the dogwood. And the dogwood grows about 15 to 20 feet, spreads about 15 to 25 feet. And so that's why it's considered a small tree. In addition, the dogwood likes to flower in March and in April. So our native dogwood is a fairly early bloomer, and it flowers before its leaves come out. Now, the one thing about dogwood trees in general is that dogwood trees have what we call shallow roots. So when you plant your dogwood tree, it's very important, especially during a drought time period, that you water that dogwood tree 1 hour once a week. And that watering, what that means is that you take a hose and you put the hose on a trickle, you bring the hose out to the tree, and you'll put that hose, if it's an established tree, about 3 to 4 feet away from the trunk of the tree, and just leave it on that trickle for about an hour if we're having a drought. The other thing is that a dogwood can be planted in full sun, but a dogwood, when you're out in the woods and you're walking, a dogwood is what we call an understory tree. And an understory tree means that it grows under other trees. And so while you can plant a dogwood in full sun, the native dogwood, it really is a lot happier if it's got a little bit of shade. Otherwise, as I said, drought can stress it out too much, and then you need to make sure that you water it. But if you like a dogwood that wants a lot more sun, then the dogwood to consider is Yokusa Dogwood. And the Kousa dogwood, the leaves are very, very, very similar. So in my left hand are the leaves of, here, let me go with this one, are the leaves of a Kousa dogwood, and in my right hand are the leaves of a native dogwood, also known as Cornus florida. And you can see they're very, very similar, but the berries are different. So actually the Kousa dogwood definitely has the berries, where the native dogwood has the dupes. And the Kousa dogwood berries do turn red in the fall as well. They are edible. And so as edible berries, I've been told that they actually make great wine. I haven't tried it, so I don't know, but sometimes some people find this to be a little messy with the berries falling on the ground. So I already mentioned that the Kousa dogwood is the dogwood to consider if you want to plant with more lighting. However, when you start getting down to the zone 7B or even zone 8, where it's a little warmer, we here in Northern Virginia are in zone 7A. So when you start getting to your warmer climes, both dogwoods need more shade. Even the Kousa at that time needs a little bit of shade in the afternoon. One of the things that is important to note about the Kousa dogwood versus the native dogwood is that the Kousa dogwood will actually flower 1 month later. Because I've had people come and say, well, I bought the Kousa dogwood because I have a warmer location, so I wanted that. Also, what I like about the Kousa dogwood is that the flowers are different than the native dogwood, because the native dogwood has these flowers that are rounded by the edge. Meanwhile, the Kousa dogwood has stellar flowers. The flowers actually look star-shaped because the flowers have tips at the end. And so they bloom out a month later than the Kousa dogwood. So don't worry, the Kousa dogwood blooms out 1 month later than the native dogwood. So don't worry if you have your flowering native dogwood going on and the Kousa's lagging behind, because that gives you a little more interest with the dogwoods. Now, the next tree is what I call what's not to love about this tree. And this tree is the redbud tree. And just take a look at the leaves of a redbud. The leaves are heart-shaped, and they are so beautiful. As a matter of fact, like your dogwoods, and actually like any flowering tree, what happens is that the flowers come out first, and the flowers of the redbud are this gorgeous pink. And the redbud is also a native tree here in Northern Virginia and the East Coast at South Carolina, North Carolina. So when you're driving, and you're driving maybe around the Appalachian Mountain region, or maybe you're driving down one of our gorgeous parkways and you take a look in April and May and you see all this pink just around you. Well, that pink, 9 times out of 10, it's the pink of the flowers of the native redbud tree. A redbud tree is what I like to call more of a small to medium tree because it can get as tall as 20 to 30 feet. And this is what's interesting about the redbud. Its spread can get as much as 40 feet wide. So when you look at a redbud, the top of the redbud is wider than the height of the redbud. So the redbud almost looks like it's got a little flat top. And it's kind of cute looking for that reason. The other thing about a redbud is that a redbud also puts out these bean pods. And these bean pods do turn brown in the winter. They really don't fall off the tree. They just kind of stay there and hang there. So often you'll see that the tree loses its leaves in the winter months, but it hasn't lost the pods. And these pods are edible. So I wouldn't eat them when they're brown because that's like done too much, but when they're green, that's when they're edible. And the other thing, our Native Americans are just phenomenal when it comes to using plants that are native to us for medicinal purposes. And both the redbud as well as the native dogwood tree bark has been used to make tea, which can help with fevers or stomach problems or dysentery, just anything, even calming teas. So I can't tell you how to do that. I don't know how to do that, but at least there's this use of the trees beyond just the beauty that they can give to your lawn. One of the most popular trees, in addition to the flowering and native dogwood, is the cherry tree. Now, the cherry tree, I'm talking about the flowering cherry tree versus the fruit cherry tree here. And the cherry tree that I'm talking about is both the Yoshino Cherry as well as the Kwanzan Cherry. And the Yoshino Cherry was actually introduced to the United States and first planted in the United States in 1912. It was a gift from Japan, and it was planted by Helen Taft, who was the wife of the President William Taft, and Viscountess Chinda, who was the wife of the Japanese ambassador to the United States. And they planted the first 2 Yoshino cherry trees around the tidal basin. And over the next time period, meaning the next few days actually, the numerous Yoshino cherry trees were planted totally around the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. Soon to follow was the Kwanzan cherry tree, also planted around the tidal basin. The 2 trees are often mistaken if you don't take time to see what the difference is. And when you take the time, the difference is phenomenal. The flowers on the Yoshino cherry are very delicate. The Yoshino cherry is in the rose family, and so oftentimes some people will think of roses when they see that flower with the Yoshino cherry. It tends to be a light pink, sometimes it's a white. And the Yoshino cherry is what is considered a medium to tall tree. It is about 30 to 40 feet tall. It's about 20 to 50 feet wide. I mean, this tree can get wide. So when you look at the Yoshino cherry, the canopy, which is what we talk about the top, that actually is wider than what you'd see with the Kwanzan. And like any of the flowering trees, again, the flowers emerge before the leaves do. Now, when you're considering whether or not to plant a cherry tree, oh, and I forgot to mention, it does bloom in March and April, and the Kwanzan tree actually blooms 2 weeks after the Yoshino blooms. Cherry trees, though, could give you a problem with the roots. As some of my friends like to say, they find that cherry trees have very muscular, thick roots that come to the surface. And if you're going to plant a cherry tree which likes sun, it can be planted all right in partial shade, but it actually prefers sun, then please do not plant the cherry tree any closer than 10 feet near a driveway or near the curb or near the sidewalk. It won't penetrate the foundation of your house. It's not that strong, but it will grow under your sidewalk, it will grow under your driveway, and it will elevate those areas. And a lot of people say, well, gee, just do what we call root pruning, cutting the roots of the tree when you see it growing under the driveway. Please don't do that, because if you root prune a tree, then you've just cut its lifespan. And cherry trees in general are very short-lived. They live only about 25 years in the landscape. Now, the Kwanzan cherry, this is a cherry tree that you can recognize from miles when you have the vision to see them. Bright pink double flowers. The flowers, the petals of the flowers look like they're cascading on top of each other. They're just phenomenal. I wish there was some in bloom right now so I could show you. They look almost like carnations, or some people say that they look like pom-poms. They're so beautiful. And I've already mentioned this, they do blossom about 2 weeks later than the Yoshino cherry trees. They also, though, have those thick, muscular roots. So that you need to be very careful, again, if you want to plant the Yoshino or the Kwanzan, then please make sure it's at least 10 to 15 feet away. And the Kwanzan tree is slightly shorter, not by much, just by about 2 or 3 feet. It is not as broad as the Yoshino cherry, so that means the canopy is a little narrower, and it actually likes the sun a lot better than your Yoshino cherry tree. Let's talk about another native tree here, and that is your maple tree. And why do I think of the maple tree next after the Yoshino cherries? It's called maple trees also like to have their roots come to the surface. So while these are beautiful trees, I mean, just the leaves just droop, and they're so beautiful, and they give you so much color in the winter, in the fall, when the leaves turn red or the leaves turn orange. Just beautiful foliage, but they have to have surface roots. So if you're going to plant a native maple tree in your yard, and one of the most popular is the sugar maple, the other very popular is the red maple, then please make sure that you're not planning on putting a lawn under the maple tree. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend that you mulch under a maple tree to what we call the drip line. And the drip line is where the leaves end and the water kind of falls off the tree, and that's why it's called the drip line. The maple, native maple, that can grow very, very tall. So that can grow 80 feet to 100 feet tall. It can be very wide. There are cultivars, though, that are a little shorter, a little wider. And I know that where I live, the builder must have decided 2 maple trees per yard. So you have 2 maple trees per yard, but you really can't have a lawn there because, again, with those roots, and if you take your lawnmower and go over those roots and start damaging the roots, then you start damaging your poor maple tree. There is another maple tree, however, that you may want to consider, which is a Japanese maple tree. And let me just show you, there are several different types of leaves with a Japanese maple. And the Japanese maple, in general, maples are called Acers botanically, but this is palmatum. And that's because the leaves, and you can see it better on this one, that's because the leaves of a maple tree are palm-shaped. See? Have your little palm. So you have some of the leaves are substantial, and then some of the leaves are very, very fragile looking. And a lot of people think that the Japanese maple has only red leaves, but the truth is that there are so many different Japanese maple cultivars that some have the thicker red leaf, some have the very thin red leaf, some have the very green leaf, and there's even one cultivar that's called the coral bark Japanese maple. The leaves are green, but the bark is actually this color of the red that you would see on the red leaves. And in the winter, after the leaves have fallen off, that coral bark Japanese maple makes such a statement because of the way the bark is. You don't need to worry about roots being a problem with the Japanese maple. And there are two types of Japanese maple. There is the upright, or what I prefer to call the standard, and it's a small tree. It gets about 15 to 20 feet tall. And then the other Japanese maple is the weeping maple. And the weeping maple, that can be as short, believe it or not, as 2 feet. The average weeping maple is about 8 feet tall, and it cascades. And it can be 12 to 14 feet wide. The other good thing about that weeping maple, or I like to call it a fountain maple, because when I look at it, it reminds me of just a water fountain or a fountain of leaves. It is just so pretty. And that actually can be what I call containerized. What that means is if you live in a townhouse where you don't really have a large yard, it works wonderfully in your garden, or you can plant it in a pot and put it on a patio. I don't recommend, though, putting it on a porch where you're elevated because the weight would be too much. But it can live for years in that container. So the Japanese maple is something to consider. One thing I do want to mention about maple trees in general is that maple trees do have seed pods, and sometimes if you have a very warm winter, those seed pods will drop in the ground, and next thing you know, you have all these little maple trees all over your lawn. Well, there really isn't anything as far as a weed kill. The best way to get rid of them is just to keep mowing your lawn until you don't have those little maple trees. Another tree from Japan that I'd like to talk about is called the Zelkova. And the Zelkova, it is a very, very large tree. It can get about 80 feet tall. It is more of what we sometimes call in the trade a pyramidal tree. So its spread is usually more like 20 or 40 feet. There are some cultivars of the Zelkova that work well in your yard. You don't need to worry about the roots on a Zelkova. The other thing is a Zelkova is a great substitute for the American elm. As a matter of fact, the Zelkova is in the elm family. and it does not get the Dutch elm disease that our poor American trees do. So I highly recommend it. It is what we call a street tree, so you can plant it between the sidewalk and the street, and it thrives in any type of environment and any type of conditions. With so many trees to choose from, and I didn't even go through all of the trees that are wonderful here in your location, especially if we're talking about Northern Virginia. There is no way you can go wrong with any of these trees, whether you want a flowering tree or a shade tree. As long as you plant the tree in the right location, there is only one great choice, and that choice is the tree that you want. If you have any questions about these trees or any plants in your garden, just contact me at misty@burkenursery.com. I'm your host, Misty Kuceris, and I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me here at Gardening with Burke Nursery. I'm looking forward to helping you grow your garden.
Funding for this program is made possible by Burke Nursery and Garden Center in Burke, Virginia. You'll find trees and shrubs, perennials and annuals, water garden supplies, houseplants, and bird and gardening supplies. Burke Nursery also provides landscape, plant diagnostic, and installation services, and much more. For more information, you can check out their website or call 703-323-1188.